Welcome to the Supply Chain Pioneers podcast, where we highlight industry leaders on the forefront of innovation and technology in planning, procurement, and logistics. Hosted by your supply chain pro to know, Ulf Venn.
So I am Greta Koch indeed, and I work for Axel Voss. I have done that since 2020. So for 4 years, I've been his policy advisor, his press officer. And then we started working on supply chains. I've been working on due diligence for 4 years now as well, because there was an initiative report in the Parliament and the Commission made its proposal. And since then, we have been negotiating what should have been the next European Supply Chain Act.
Supply Chain Pioneers is powered by Everstream Analytics. Everstream gives you the predictive insights and analytics to make your supply chain faster, smarter, safer, and leaner. Go to everstream.ai to book your demo today. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Supply Chain Pioneers. And with me today, I have Greta Koch, and she's a policy advisor and press officer to Axel Voss, and also a technical negotiator for the European Parliament, and especially responsible for the corporate supply chain due diligence law, which is also called CSDDD. And hello, Greta.
Hi.
So, Greta, before we start talking about you and the CSDDD and a lot of other supply chain and AI topics, maybe quickly introduce yourself.
Yes, so I am Greta Koch indeed, and I work for Axel Voss. I have done that since 2020. So for 4 years, I've been his policy advisor, his press officer, his assistant in all kinds of needs. And I've been working on AI because my boss is an MEP for the EPP group in the Parliament, and he actually mostly worked on digital topics. So he was known for the copyright directive. He did the GDPR, so it was more digital-oriented office. And then we started working on supply chains, and we have done that actually since I've been working in this office. So I've been working on due diligence for 4 years now as well, because there was an initiative report in the Parliament and the Commission made its proposal. And since then, we have been negotiating what should have been the next European Supply Chain Act, the Due Diligence Directive. And yeah, that's my background.
Yeah, and we're going to deep dive on all of that today. But before we start, given the current situation, and I think that's something we just need to get out of the way, it is right now essentially on hold, right? The due diligence law. And it would be great maybe if you can share with us what you think is going to happen now and what is the potential outlook on a European-wide due diligence law.
Yes, indeed. So we had an official political agreement back in December after a long trilogue session. So we started trilogues already, I think, in June or in July of last year. We had extensive meetings. I was also in almost every single technical trilogue meeting since then. Those were a lot of meetings that also took a long time. So usually, around 8 hours of negotiation. So it was very, very extensive since it's a very important law. It's also a very long and complicated text. And so this took a while. And so we had a couple of political trilogues, where you get back in the Spanish presidency. You have Commissioner Reinders, who was present. You have all the shadows. You have Rapporteur Lara Wolters all in one room. That happened, I think, 4 or 5 times last year. And then the last one was the one in December, where we concluded the trilogue. And the member states usually have a commitment to stick to the trilogue agreement, because it's based on a negotiation between what the Parliament wanted and what the Council wanted. And actually, especially in this case, the Council actually got everything they wanted. So since then, the discussions with the member states were slightly surprising, because several member states, very famously among them Germany, suddenly did not back what happened in the trilogue agreement, although this reflected very much the Council position. And so since then, Germany has been backtracking, and so have other member states. So since then, there's no majority for this text in the Council anymore. Which does not happen very often when you already have a political agreement, and certainly doesn't happen very often right before an election campaign. And so we're stuck indeed. There's no movement in council right now because the Belgian presidency now really tries its best just to come to a conclusion among all the member states to really find a text that everyone can support, which is a very, very tricky situation right now because we're not in official negotiations anymore. Yeah, so they're still trying their best, but we're really running out of time because the elections are coming up and there's always a deadline for the texts that we can still vote in this mandate, right? So we have to hand in a text to the parliament. This needs to be translated. This needs to be looked at by the legal services, and then it needs to be voted by the entire parliament. And of course, we need time for that. But now it's beginning of March, and the last session to still vote this file in plenary is at the end of April. And so basically we have 2 weeks left, I think, until which there needs to be a conclusion for this law to still pass. And so that's why I think, we're under immense time pressure. Everybody still tries their best, but there seems to be no willingness among member states to still pass this through. And so as long as there's no political will, especially before an election campaign, it just gets very, very tense. And so if in 2 weeks it's decided that, it's impossible to still get a deal, then we will try our best to still work on this in the next legislature. But then, it's also difficult because then it's a different commission, there's a different council, it's a different parliament, and probably then also a different text.
Let's hope for the best, right? And maybe people in supply chain dedicated to the topic can maybe help. But let's talk about that later. So before we go into more depths around what would have been the supply chain law and also other things related to AI and supply chain, I want to talk quickly about you and introduce a person that is Greta Koch, because I saw already on looking through your CV that you were closely aligned to things that are essentially part of the supply chain, because you started with a thesis on sanction. You researched digitalization and also the relationship to China, and China is very important for supply chains, obviously. And now you're working on the sustainability topic and you work also on AI. All of that essentially touches supply chain. Topics you cover are also the hot topics that we have in supply chain management. So how did you develop a keen interest around all of these? I would call them, if you look at them single out, they might look a little bit like not closely related. For us, supply chain glues it together, but what does it glue together for you?
So I actually have to say that this development was not completely linear. I didn't have a keen interest in supply chain due diligence from the start. I studied European studies, and from then on, of course, I wanted to delve into different policy topics to see what actually interests me. And I did some very, very interesting internships already, also in the German Bundestag. I already did an internship here in the European Parliament, and that touched those topics kind of by accident. And so I indeed got very closely to the topic of supply chains, more or less by accident. And also the fact that I've been working on supply chain due diligence in this office with Axel Voss was honestly more of an accident than, on purpose. And so it's to me, it's also quite fascinating to see that it is all interconnected and built upon, although I never planned it that way. But it's just this intersection of sustainability together with company law has always fascinated me. I've always been interested in how companies can, do better in their sustainability performance, how we can make sure that companies contribute to massive climate change that we have to deal with in the next years, because that's also a topic that, was very close to my generation's heart, so to say. I'm more Fridays for Future kind of generation. And so this was always very fascinating to me. And also, I always found the dialogue with companies very, very interesting, to have this very clear alignment with what actually works in practice and what is happening on the policy field has always interested me. And so although I never chose this path, I'm very, very happy that I got here.
Good. So let's maybe continue on that. You have started to experience supply chain quite in depth, especially right now, due to the negotiations. What did you think about supply chain management and supply chains before you started working on that? And now you probably have a lot of new exposure. And how did that change your perception on supply chain management?
I have to say that it actually changed a lot. So if you look at the amendments that we tabled as Axel Voss to the very first report by Lara Wolters and the deal that we now made, those are very different approaches to supply chain due diligence. Because you have an outlook on it that was mostly influenced by the German law, I would say, because in 2020 also the German law started to develop. Back then we already said, look, it's better to have a European framework right away. You don't want to put German companies in that situation that they have to fulfill a German law in 2020, or was it 2021? I'm not sure anymore. And then a European one in 2026 or whatever, then, you know, maybe it's not the same text. They would have to change the entire process that they already built up. And so, yeah, it was quite clear for us that it needed a European approach and also no fragmentation of the single market, because obviously all supply chains are interconnected, right? As a company, you will always have somehow a supplier that's not in your near vicinity. And so this international aspect of it was quite important. But I think that the approach changes the more you inform yourself about the topic, because you start with what we copied from the German law, which is the tier 1 approach. You say it's completely impossible to check the entire supply chain. They can only check the tier 1. This is what they're responsible for. This is where you can ask for the information. Beyond that, it's just way too difficult. It's way too much bureaucracy. And so we started with a tier 1 approach. We said stakeholders should have nothing to do with it. Liability should be limited. We shouldn't even look at climate due diligence because it's completely impossible. And this is also the approach that I had at the start, to be honest, that I just said, it's way too difficult to do it, let's not. And the more you learn about best practices and the more you learn about how companies have already been doing due diligence for years, because of course this is also informed by the international standards on due diligence. So when it comes to the OECD framework or the UNGPs, there are companies that have been doing this for 10 years or even longer. So this is not a completely new topic to everyone. As soon as you start talking to those people, you really get a much more informed outlook on supply chains, because you realize that maybe for some companies and for some sectors, you know, a tier 1 approach is already difficult, but it doesn't have to be an approach where you have to check every single one. So on the German law, for instance, to really check every single one of your tier 1 suppliers is, of course, a huge bureaucratic task that is not necessarily necessary. Because you have suppliers that might have risks, but you will also in your tier 1 have a lot of suppliers that actually, you know, do not contribute to human rights risks or to environmental risks. And you don't need to check those. This was also very clearly our approach to the European law. But you should also go further, because since not all of your risks will be in your tier 1, actually your most severe ones will not be in tier 1 at all. It will go further down the supply chain. There needs to be something happening there. And I think the biggest turnaround we really had was on engagement with stakeholders, because in the beginning we said like, oh, okay, but then every NGO wants to talk to every company. It's going to be, you know, way too much bureaucracy again, way too much input. They will ask questions that are completely unnecessary. And then you actually realize all the questions that companies are asking, which is, how far do I have to go in my supply chain? If I find a risk, how do I mitigate it? Can only be answered by a proper stakeholder engagement. So if you talk to those people that are affected by your actions, they can tell you if you're doing it better now, if you've corrected your actions, or if you should try harder. And this is actually, I think, the biggest turnaround is really whenever you feel like, you know, it's too much risk, it's too much liability, it's, you know, I'm facing sanctions, the people that can bring you before court are the ones you should ask about your due diligence strategy. And they can really, you know, also help in making this law a success, because it's also very important that, you know, it's not only about bureaucracy, it's about actually changing something on the ground, which I think will also not happen with a tier 1 approach. I don't think that the German law right now greatly contributes to human rights risks. I honestly doubt that. And I think that the further down you go in your supply chain, the more of an impact you will have. And that happens if you talk to your stakeholders.
Mm. Yeah. So first of all, on the German law, we have found the BAFA has found zero evidence of problems in supply chains from German companies, which is, I would say, daring, given we have very famous companies producing in the Xinjiang province, which is banned by the US for its forced labor practices. So that's already an interesting take, essentially. But I personally thought that the EU supply chain law, if you want to talk risk management on that, maybe is the German supply chain law was more looking at a strategic version of it, looking at what is the likeliness of somebody to have an issue. And then you essentially start a management process around that. And then the EU law was more, okay, there is an issue, let's fix it and let's make sure we can. So it's a more tactical approach on really doing something and operationalizing risk management, which I personally appreciate a lot more and also believe to be less work for companies. So I thought it was a good switch up and more fitting to the topic of supply chain to react, because by heart, everybody working in supply chain is a firefighter, right? There are problems anywhere, you just got to fix it. And that's, I think, that speaks more to the heart of a supply chain person. So I thought it was I still believe it's a good law, actually.
Well, I think it's not perfect, but indeed, it really is a risk-based approach. And people always call the German law also a risk-based approach, but it hasn't worked in practice. Companies are still, because they're fearing, liability and so on, they're still checking every single supplier down to the last detail, and not only the suppliers of the product that they are responsible for, but even, the pens that they use in their office. So it's like if you're, I don't know, BMW, they don't only check the parts of the cars that they're selling, but even the pen that they're writing with, down to toilet paper. So the over-compliance is getting ridiculous. And so what we tried is really to have a risk-based approach that is much more clear, where you really have to focus on the most severe and most salient risks and most likely risks, so that you trace your supply chain. Yes, you have to go further than your tier one, but you focus on those where risks are most likely and most severe, and you can prioritize. So nobody's asking you to know every risk immediately and also address it immediately. You can prioritize that based on, again, likelihood and severity. And so it's a different approach. It still is not clear enough in order for companies to get fully behind it. Obviously, I think we've definitely made some mistakes in how to communicate this, because there is a lot of criticism coming, especially from companies, because they're fearing that it's basically just a German law, but extending it to the entire supply chain, which obviously would be a huge bureaucratic task that nobody is asking them to do. But yeah, we wanted to have the risk-based approach. And what I also find very, very important is that we make a difference between an obligation of result and an obligation of means. So there are things that you're clearly responsible for because you as a company are causing them, which in practice would still mean you focus on your tier one or your tier two, because this is where you really, cause impacts by setting a pricing strategy, purchasing practices, by, having contracts that maybe are a bit shady, but that you are causing. And those are the ones that you really have an obligation to tackle. You have to mitigate risks that you caused or you contributed to. And also you can only be held liable for those that you caused yourself. Nobody is being held liable for something that you cannot identify, that you have no connection to because it's in your tier 6 and you don't even know what is happening there. This is not what we're doing here. It's really a difference between obligation of result, which is when you caused it, and everything else is an obligation of means, which just means do your best, please do your best. And I think this is, of course, a new approach to this kind of law. And it's also difficult to even put this into a law if it's more like a voluntary scheme at a certain point. But we tried our best to try to articulate that. And apparently wasn't done well enough, but I still think we should build on that strategy.
Yeah. And I also don't think it means a lot more work for companies, essentially, right? Because if it's really like a bad business practice coming from the sub tiers, it's going to land in the media anyway. And that's something that companies also anyway would try to avoid. So they will have to manage it even if it's not a law. But it's good to put it in practice, manifest it, because some companies might choose to not do it. And yeah, it's, from a competitive standpoint, it's good if we have a level playing field, I believe, for companies operating in the European Union. So it would have been great to get that through.
No, I think the level playing field argument is definitely strong. So without the European law, you will have probably, we already have the German law, we have the French law, and other member states will follow through. And then maybe in the end, we come up with, I don't know, 17 different national laws, which is also not ideal. It's not helping the companies that have to adhere to them. It's not helping the suppliers that have to give information, even the ones that, really need the help. That's definitely one thing. Whether it's more work or less work really entirely depends on your business structure. Because I think for some companies, indeed, not having to check every single one in your tier one will be a huge relief of burden, while for others, the fact that you have to go beyond tier one will add more bureaucracy. And that, I think, really depends on how much leverage you have and how much you are causing impacts beyond your tier one. And that really depends on your business model, on your brand, on your structure. So I would say, it depends, but I would say that it's definitely a more targeted bureaucracy, because it should be a law that's also more effective.
Yeah. And talking about maybe, let's take the topic of efficiency real quick. So what I believe personally to be the most efficient sustainability law on planet Earth is a UFLPA, the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act of the USA, which daily makes a difference by blocking shipments coming out of the Xinjiang province that is deemed to be problematic when it comes to human rights. Having it executed by a authority like a border protection, like customs clearance, is making it very efficient, because they anyway work on sanctions already for a long time. Is that like a European version of that? Would that also be something that is, we know it's in discussion, but is that a likely thing to happen in the future? What do you think?
Sorry, on what exactly?
The Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Is there a European version coming?
Yes, there's a deforestation regulation coming, which is also, I think, not without its bureaucratic burden. So that is definitely coming. Whether something similar in terms of border control is happening, I would say this is happening also with the Forced Labor Act, actually, because forced labor is more of a trading instrument. It's not so much company law that companies have to, check where forced labor is in their products, but it's essentially a trading mechanism, because at the border it's checked whether it's coming from Xinjiang or not, and then it's forbidden. So that's a different mechanism. I think that's an interesting idea, but also very difficult when it not only is focusing on forced labor, very difficult to enforce, because with due diligence, we're not talking about, the worst of the worst. We're not only talking about bad labor and forced labor, but it also has, in terms of sustainability, a huge environmental aspect to it. It's not only deforestation, but it's also, anything relating to environmental damage, to poisoning of seas or lakes or whatever. It's actually a huge list of issues that we're trying to tackle with this obligation of means approach, that you really try to do your best. And this is something that, with a border control mechanism would be a much more strict thing, which I think works great for the worst issues. But since we're trying to tackle a much broader field of sustainability issues, I think it's clear that due diligence needs to remain a company law issue.
Okay, that's very interesting. I never thought about this. Great, actually. So having said that, we now understand the EU supply chain law as it is right now might not come, but we still have around 2 weeks, and the podcast is coming out very soon. So we still will have 2 weeks to help make a difference. So I believe especially people in Germany and Italy might try to help in one way, shape, or form, convince your government to help you get the law through? Do you know if there's any way that people that listening to the podcast can help, maybe looking at this once again and maybe reshaping opinions by bringing professional advice?
I think it's especially important to talk to governments if you're German or Italian, because those are really the ones that could change something right now. But to be honest, I'm not sure it's very smart to do that right now, because whatever the governments would be asking for to delete would be happening without a proper political procedure. It's not like we can go back into the negotiation room. There's also no negotiation room where all member states would be present. And what would happen now is that the parliament would make huge concessions in order to get maybe Italy or Germany on board. I think that there's not really an interest of those countries of that still happening. But basically we would be deleting entire parts of the law without anyone, properly checking. I think there's a better way to do better lawmaking. At this point, honestly, I think it's still the best way to go for next mandate and start maybe even from scratch, because I don't think that everything that we've worked for, and also that I've personally, I'm personally very involved in this, because this has been my life for the last 4 years, and I feel like kind of this is my life's work. But I would not feel bad with starting from scratch now, because we have definitely learned a lot of lessons. There's a lot of things that went wrong, but also a lot of things that went very well, that I think would still, work next mandate. And it's just that we need more time in order to get more people on board to understand what we're doing here, to really get the message across. We've tried to communicate to all kinds of industry associations in the last 4 years, but apparently it was not enough. So we have to do better. The communication needs to be better, and we need to convince more people that this is the right approach. And for that, we need more time than 2 weeks.
That's very cool. I mean, it is a big commitment, right? Saying, okay, I have 4 years, and then you go and say, we've learned so much, we can make even a better law next time, is, I think, very admirable. But how do you deal with the frustration you might feel right now, given that actually I thought the result was really good? So how do you cope with this? What is the answer to seeing what's transpiring right now?
I mean, of course, it's frustrating because, you put so much time and so much effort in this, and then you don't see the result, because it's always nice to put so much energy into something to then finally, have this moment. Like, you really look forward to that moment when it's finally voted and when you feel like, okay, I have contributed to a law that's actually going to happen. But if there's so much criticism around this, I don't see why we have to force it. That's more my approach. If we have not managed to convince too many, enough people that this is the right approach, then we just need to take more time to do better. I don't doubt that we already did a very good work, but right now it doesn't look like it's very, it's not welcomed with open arms by the council, and that should tell us something. And so I think with any failure in that sense, you deal with saying, I learned a lot and next time I will do better.
Really good. So let's switch gears away from European supply chain laws and more on the topic of AI, because it's another part of what you do on a daily basis is think about AI and talk about AI. So in your eyes, is AI more an opportunity or is it more risk? And what do you think about your own view versus what the general consensus in the EU Parliament is around AI as a topic?
Yeah. I'm struggling to answer that question with just saying I think there's more opportunities with AI, although I'm more leaning towards that, because obviously there are huge risks, and certain people and certain governments can certainly make use of AI in order to really turn our world into a dystopia. And I think that's real, and that's already, influencing us in a way. But of course, you can also definitely use AI for good, and there's a lot of opportunities around AI. I also truly believe that in order to solve climate change issues, I do think that the technology at some point, even if we don't have it yet and we don't know what it will look like, technology will be the turning point in the end, because I'm sure with AI, the developments are so extremely quick that I think we don't even know what will be the newest technology on the market next year. When my boss and especially my colleague were working on the AI Act, and they started this also in 2020, nobody knew that ChatGPT was happening. You couldn't even imagine ChatGPT. And this was only 4 years ago, right? And now the ChatGPT discussion already formed the AI Act, kind of. And so I think that, of course, there are huge opportunities that I hope we can still have a taste of in the future. Of course, I think in the parliament there's more a focus on the risks rather than the opportunities, because you regulate the risks. Policy-wise, of course, you tackle the risks because you can ban certain things, you can regulate certain things. And when it comes to using opportunities, what you need is investment. And that's not what a parliament does is necessarily, you have investment strategies, obviously, but there's just a lot of focus on regulation. And focusing so much on regulation, again, leads to the same arguments of the EU is too bureaucratic, EU is burdening too many companies, and so on. So there are some parallels, I would say, in the supply chain discussion versus the AI Act discussion. But in the end, I think it's the opportunities that will count in the future, and we're already doing our best to regulate the risks. I think the EU, with the AI Act, that is a very strong landmark regulation, has done its best there. And so I'm not sure if my view is so strongly shared in the parliament. It's just that the focus, obviously, of a regulatory framework is more on the risks.
Yeah, but there is obviously a lot of risk, right? In one of the previous episodes, we talked about cybersecurity and cyber risks in supply chains. And one of the things that is tremendously changed already right now is there's phishing. Obviously, everybody knows phishing, but there's also vishing, which is using voice to essentially fake being a senior executive and then getting access to sensitive data. And that has never been easier than with AI now, because you get a lot of recordings. You can train an AI on a voice very easily. You can make it say whatever you want. And that's obviously very dangerous, frankly. And there needs to be more precautions. And on the other side, there's also a lot of new defense mechanisms coming with AI. So you always have the good and bad, and no matter which topic you look at.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I absolutely agree. But of course, on the downside, like things that I already see are also deepfakes on Instagram, for instance. There are some things that are actually quite entertaining, like Angela Merkel talking about the Döner prices in Germany. But even there, some people think this is real, which, then you also realize, okay, we have to really also invest in digital skills sometimes. But of course, there are huge risks, but I think we're just on top of regulating them already. And then there are the benefits. And also when it comes to supply chains, actually, what I've seen in the last 4 years is that there's a huge development also in the AI field on supply chains, because of course it's difficult to get information from all suppliers, but with AI, especially on those risks that you can very clearly pinpoint, which are, again, child labor, forced labor, these kinds of things, or specific international conventions, the AI development is already great. Like I've seen AI tools that actually can digitalize your entire supply chain. They know every single supplier, they know the supplier of the suppliers, and they know the risks already. And they can show you that with one click and without asking them for information, because it's based on public data, because of export data. This has been possible and was developed in the last 4 years. So by the time we would have had the European law, I think even more was possible. And I think we should use those benefits.
The famous last question is always what I call the hobby question, but it can also be about passion. And for you, I found that you have taught first aid for a very long time. And we have a lot of listeners that work in risk and crisis management, because supply chain managers are firefighters at heart. So given first aid is the ultimate crisis, right? If something like this happens, everything else stops. Nothing is more important than that. So what is your suggested strategy for people that are in a situation like this to stay calm and collected, which I think is always the first step of managing a crisis successfully?
This will sound like the most basic answer ever, but for me, it's actually true. It's take a deep breath, because it really calms you down for a second. It makes everything go slow for a second. Take a deep breath in, take a deep breath out, and focus on what you need to do. And I think that's not only in first aid, you can even use that in like political negotiations. Like sometimes it gets very stressful and you're under a lot of pressure and you need to make a decision, which sounds like the biggest decision in the world and everybody's stressing you about it. And you just need to take a second, realize that it's not the end of the world. Take a, breathe in, breathe out, and everything follows from there. And then you can, focus on what you need to do. That's honestly how I do it. I don't have any further secrets than that.
But that is a good skill to have. Taking a deep breath and distancing yourself from a situation is a good start. And that's what we're going to do now. We're going to take a deep breath, and then we're going to close out the show, actually. Thank you so much for being here. That was a pleasure.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Always. Maybe you come back at one point. So
I would be happy to, yeah.
Yeah, maybe next time we have a successful law, and then we're going to have a big discussion on why, actually, because it's going to be amazing. So I wish you a great further journey. I think you have the right spirit to really help us make a difference for sustainability in supply chain. So I hope you stay on that topic, actually.
I hope so too.
Yeah. And with that, I want to close out the show and say to all listeners, bye-bye.
Bye.
This was Supply Chain Pioneers. Thanks for watching, listening, or however you are enjoying this podcast. You can find Supply Chain Pioneers on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all other major podcast players, as well as on YouTube at Ulf Talk Supply Chain. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. See you next time.